Let's start with, I want to play and get your feedback on a couple of clips specifically, which I think we already really alluded to in the Alexander Coburn thing, but how to deal with these Reopen America protests. Now, I do want to say, I think we actually have an Abby Martin clip of some drive protests, I think in LA, of people demanding stuff like rent freezes and action on those types of issues. And we know that on a federal level that Bernie Sanders and Rashida Tlaib and AOC and Ilhan Omar and Ro Khanna God, I think, what's his name? Ryan, that guy who ran for president for a minute, actually, Tim Ryan have put forward some various types of decent legislation, which of course the Democratic leadership is not moving on, with their typical failure. But I just want to put in context that the part of these reducing these protests to just AstroTurf or just, extremism is not smart, not accurate, not strategic. And at the same time, it's very important to note and put down that the press and social media, everybody's giving these a lot of oxygen while people attempting to form themselves, whether in these really incredible strike actions we've been talking about, or even Piper with the great work they're doing at Harvard, or people getting in their cars and driving around Mayor Carcetti's house, is not receiving anywhere near that type of attention. And I think that that does need to be put in the context for assessing these things. But I don't know if I think we have some sound to play for this stuff, but Joshua, I basically want to throw to you, kind of talk about how do we respond and think about the get back to work protests.
Yeah, I love the way you teed that up. And let's circle back to both the media attention piece and the amount, because these things are not bigger than the protests that are happening responsibly, that are being done with like social distancing in every city in the country around everything from, rent to getting unhoused people housed in vacant hotel rooms to, so let's mark that. And then also I want to mark the way you're complicating the notion of astroturfing, because the way we dichotomize grassroots and astroturfing is often not useful. But one of the reasons why I was interested in talking about this is that most of the left media reactions that I've seen have just been outrage at the protesters. And I want to start just by, offering some compassion to that reaction, because that was, part of my reaction at first too. When I was seeing like Proud Boys blocking ambulances, I was pissed off, and like when I would see, and I had a moment of reducing like, who are these assholes who are like coming to like downtown, to state houses and facilitating the spread of a virus that they claim to not believe in, that is then going to disproportionately impact people who live downtown, and they're going to go back home. And like, there's, and I think about people, there's actually a doctor who I met because he's a patron of this show, Dr. Osgood, who reached out to me on Instagram because he's a watcher of the show. And I was thinking about, some of his posts where he's talking about what it's like to be a doctor right now, where he just says like, too much death, can't clean it off. Like there's real immediate short-term consequences to these protests. And so I also don't want to, I understand the reaction of anger is what I'm saying. That stated, if we stay there,
that's important. Yep.
Yeah, if we stay there and don't actually have compassion for and empathy for people who are coming out to these protests, then we don't have a basis of curiosity. And if we don't have a basis of curiosity, then we can't assess our terrain and can't actually look at the landscape with clear eyes. And so as an organizer, I think about these I break it down in a couple ways, and we can kind of walk through it. I think first, who's organizing this and how is it resourced? Then who is the base that the organizers are able to mobilize? And in this case, as well as many other cases, it's a mixed base. It's heterodox. It's not just one thing reducible to a stereotype. Then I ask, what are the conditions that allow this base to be mobilized, and where's there an opportunity for us on the left? And then I ask, what's the architecture of the tactical execution of it? What can we learn from that? And then what's the strategy behind that? And what does that say about, in this case, the relationship between popular mobilization and political parties? Because one of the things that has always fascinated me is that the right doesn't do street mobilizations very often. Not nearly as often as the left, because that's a tool of people power. When you don't have money, the right usually, exerts its political will in other ways. But when they do, there's always an inside-outside strategy behind it that has an electoral relationship with people in power and people who are funding it. And that's why there's the comparisons to the Tea Party are useful. And that's why the accusations of astroturfing, let's start there in the question of who's organizing it, which is, and let me also just give the caveat that I usually don't comment on street protests or tactics unless I'm like physically a part of it or get to see it firsthand. And this I'm obviously observing secondhand. So I'm sure there's even more complexity than I'm able to see. And so I want to just also acknowledge that. But from what I can tell, a lot of this was seeded, of course, by the DeVos family through the Michigan Freedom Fund. And so just because they're funding it doesn't mean there's a distinction between, a lot of protests on the left have paid professional organizers involved as well. That doesn't mean that they're not legitimately mobilizing a grassroots base. It just means some people get to dedicate their resources full-time to mobilizing that base, right? There's a difference between, when the right accuses us of that, they assume every protester who's there is paid to be there, and they're not there out of authentic concerns. And I think it's lazy for us to imagine that all of these protesters are like somehow paid by the DeVos family to be there. That's just there's no way that's possibly the case. But you ask who, from what I can tell, is there some of this base that is like, suburban crybabies who can't handle a little bit of compromise of their personal comfort with no sense of collective responsibility or sacrifice? Sure. That's like obviously a part of this base. And like, what are the conditions that give rise to that? Any basic analysis of privilege and the like little bubble of snowflake republicanism can explain that. That's not that interesting to me. And that's where I think most of the left kind of focuses their outrage on, because it's so irritating. And it is irritating. But there's also obviously a large base of people turning out who are working class people who are legitimately suffering, who don't trust a government that is on one hand telling them that it's going to take away their means to make a living, and on the other hand, not giving them a way to sustain themselves, in return for that. And of course, they don't trust the governments to be able to take care of them. And we get frustrated that they might be in a media bubble where the conclusions they draw are that the virus is fake or whatever, but it's a very reasonable reaction to say, what am I going to do right now? You're not going to take care of me, and you're the same ones telling me that I can't take care of myself. Of course, it's going to valorize the I'm going to pull myself up by my bootstraps. I want the right to work right now kind of ethos. And the conditions that give rise to that are also obvious, and ones that the Democrats are clearly not thinking about, which is that you can't pair social restrictions without social support. And so if there isn't a way of providing for people's wages, if there isn't a way for providing people's health care, then this is a predictable reaction. And it might have been seeded by the DeVos family and it's happening earlier in the cycle than it would have otherwise. But if sheltering in place needs to continue on, it was going to happen anyway. And actually blaming the DeVos family for this and deriding it just as astroturf is missing the forest for the trees. There's also a component of the base that is worth naming that is I don't want to go into as much, but is scarier to me, which is that there is a white supremacist element that ranges from the Proud Boys to these militias that are getting mobilized. And those are folks who've been looking for excuses to be mobilized in general. And those conditions are, it's a response to change couched in white supremacy. And some of it is like a kind of empowered apocalypticism, at least on the part of the militias. And so these are heterodox is what I'm saying. And I'll pause there before, should I talk about the architecture? I also want to just give you a chance to respond.
No, I think this is great. I don't even think we need to play any of the sound. I think this is really important. But I think, okay, let me just recap. So, yes, you have to understand and look at funding. Of course, the DeVos family, important, hugely dangerous, predatory, oligarchic influence on America. Yes. At the same time, this is a big left-wing tendency that just because something gets corporate money or that type of backing means that therefore none of it is organic. Like the difference between, it's just because it has corporate money doesn't mean it's a Potemkin village, right? Like it's an actual thing. And then I think the other thing, which is this big swath of serious discontent, which will get hit and mobilized. And again, it's the points that we always go back to: moralizing, hectoring, being mad. All this stuff is, great. Some of it's totally understandable, but it's not going to achieve anything. Only the Adolf Reed questions of, do you have to work for a living? Well, right. There you go. There's the beginning of our conversation. That is basically a totally global question that pretty much applies to everybody, east, west, north, south. And then that third, yes, there are these other very, specifically dangerous, I feel like even using dangerous like reinforces their kind of mystique. But there are these groups that represent far right, ideology and barbarism. I think the only thing I'd want to add, and I hope that's a good summation of what you've been saying, is I really would want to I actually think that the last group has started to become a corollary of the AstroTurf. So now it's like another thing where like everybody's become a Nazi. Everybody's, and it's just like, okay, even there, distinguishing between somebody with a distasteful or even repulsive personal attitude that isn't that is not a actual ideology.
Right.
And then also, again, even groups that are, look, I think there's some problem structurally, frankly, that when so much energy was put on these really disturbing, like brown shirt like deployments, in a way almost over-valorizing them, when at the same time, to me, like the big picture story was the element to which, like, obviously these ideas are seeping in the center of power, right? And affiliated with people connected to Peter Thiel or Trump or whatever. Anyway, I just want to caution on that one, because I think that's another one. 10 years ago, it was all an AstroTurf, and now it's either an AstroTurf or they're all just Nazis. And I think we got to be very, especially as there are some actual Nazi elements, be really disciplined in making those distinctions.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of ways to slice that question. One way that I slice it is, are people self-organized on purpose? And some of the militia groups are self-organized as Nazis on purpose. Other groups are, have, whether they even have a lot of the same beliefs or not, it's different organizing conditions for us, and knowing the difference matters. And because I'm, as an organizer, interested in what's the balance of forces of various social blocks in society, who's mobilizing them to what ends, and how, and then how do we play that game, right? And the Republicans are very skilled at playing that game right now. And just to break it down tactically, what I see happening is there's a template set for replicable actions, which is, at this point, at least in Michigan, seeded by a funder. So it might be the case that the first one in Michigan, let's imagine that every single one of those was paid by the DeVos family. Well, that seeds a template. Those folks then, they create talking points, organizing tools, coordinated press releases that then get sent out to various networks, right? Some of them are completely organic and, spring up on Facebook, and some of them move through other kinds of networks. Those are then used, and then it spreads, and it can spread in a rapid and organic way that no longer needs to be seeded. That's what we do as organizers as well. On the left, I mean, we don't do paid protesters. That's like not a thing. We don't have the resources to do that. But I'm not sure that they do either, you know? And then they seed their tactics where there's a mixture of the name of the group is the tactic. So it spreads the concept of the tactic. So like Gridlock PA shows like, okay, we're doing a blockade that is a moving blockade within cars. Or they'll do things like, you know, Pennsylvanians against excessive quarantine, which is like smart messaging for the name of an organization in terms of, you know, which is, you know, the difference of like, you know, Occupy Wall Street is tactically naming your group instead of naming your group about your objectives, right? And that spreads faster. And if you can control the messaging, then it's effective. But if you can't control the messaging, then all that spreads is the name of a tactic and not actually your goals, right? It does strike me that right-wing protests always get astronomical media attention, which is what you started out by saying of like, you know, it's my biggest frustration that, you know, in the climate movement, we could pull out, you know, 250,000 people to an action and it wouldn't get attention beyond local media. And you can get like a couple hundred people. Not that I'm saying this shouldn't be covered. We're covering it. I think this is it's a dramatic thing that's happening right now. But this is how I felt during the Tea Party protests of like the level of outsized megaphone that they have is tremendous. And the GOP knows how to play an inside-outside game. And so Trump's response with his tweets, like there's to me a few layers of the game being played. One is the seeding of a media narrative, and sort of Trump having basically creating a media predicate for in the fall when people are hurting, they can blame the Democrats for the fact that they're hurting, and shoring up the echo chamber of Fox News is one part. Another part is, Trump giving himself space to say there's popular support for what he's doing. Then, I'm not sure the exact game that's happened of like, I heard that today there was a number of states that in response to this lifted some social distancing measures, at least in Georgia and maybe Tennessee. I don't know what that relationship is, but there is something interesting of like training your base to feel like if they come out, there's an immediate impact. The president will respond to you. The left has nothing like that. The left, when we turn people out, we don't have people in positions of formal power validating us, or we almost never see when we win gains, it's always sort of secondarily. It's never like an immediate, the next day there's a law changed. And so you're also training your base to be more activated, which is really smart on their part. And it also shows how much the Republican Party is invested in having an inside-outside relationship that is antithetical to the Democratic Party, that is terrified of the idea of there being an outside game played, which is why, that's why it was heartbreaking when Obama mothballed OFA, because the proposition was we're going to create a vehicle for outside mobilization, which will give me space to push further to the left. When it was clear that wasn't ever part of the agenda, that was the hope with our revolution if Bernie had gotten elected. But so far on the left, that's not the role of popular pressure, is that we're not sort of doing a dance with people in power where they're looking for an excuse to move further to the left. We actually have to leverage that power for real, which is why astroturfing on the left just doesn't work. And on the right, all you have to do is have the smoke and mirrors theater of it, because the people in power are playing the game along with you. And so it means that on our side, because the media isn't going to cover it unless you play, unless you create very specific conditions, and unless you actually are mobilizing a real movement that's flexing real power, you're not going to create conditions in which you put your opposition in a bind and a real threat. We don't have the luxury of the smoke and mirrors. We don't have the luxury of spectacle, unless the whole purpose of spectacle is just to inspire your own people, which is, I don't want to deride that, but it has its limits. So that's my sense of this so far.
That's great. I think this is great. I think it's really important to understand the actual power relationships and to disaggregate who's going there and why. And And I also want to say, this is just on my mind and it might open up way too much, but I was listening recently to Connor Habib, who I've had on the show, and I was on his show, very interesting guy. And I mean, this also fits with some of my own sort of hesitation around like hegemonic language around science. And I loved the way Cornel West was talking about the distinction between a scientific sort of approach is essential and indispensable for any kind of human enterprise, like actual open inquiry and empiricism, but that the sort of dogmatism doesn't work either. And I see like in some of these arguments, and again, I'll register the same disgust, absolutely footage of, you know, some fucking idiot screaming at a nurse in a mask. I mean, you know, it's right there, and it's so repulsive and so stupid and so disgusting. But I also see as, again, part of the same kind of set of failed tactics of like, well, don't you people listen to the science? And it's like, well, first of all, no, right? Like, I think we can just answer that question. It's sort of like, how dare they? Well, they dare all the time. Like, let's just stipulate that rightly or wrongly or whatever, most people don't just listen to the science. Then I actually think we need to ask much, you know, more like in this case, it's really not that complicated. And obviously we know we just need the policy frameworks to allow people to social distance. There's no argument about that. But there's a lot of other areas where, you know, skepticism about, science as a political project is actually warranted. So I just see I just wanted to add that I just see so many tropes that really just do kind of reinforce just this sort of liberal elitism, for lack of a better word. And I think what's kind of funny and ironic is that while people are doing that game and getting self-satisfied, that's another thing that these right-wing protests always count on. You could actually add it to your grids. Like then, you know, Patton Oswalt will say, what the hell is wrong with, you know, sitting in your home and, you know, watching Netflix and ordering Thai food? And, you know, that'll be great. Like some out of touch Hollywood asshole will make a completely unrealistic assessment of like tens of millions of Americans and how they're dealing with this right now.
Did Patton Oswalt say that?
He did say something. He tweeted something to the effect of that. That is a bummer.
He was in a really good Boots Riley video.
No, I am totally. I mean, Patton's one of the ones that you're a little harder on because maybe at one point you could expect more. But, you know, or I don't even think we'll even play it. But maybe at some point we will. But I mean, this Trump ad with Nancy Pelosi and the ice cream juxtaposed with normal people's fridges. Right. By the way, normal people, and I said this going back to the Super Bowl, Trump is making a play. Normal people from a variety of racial backgrounds not having any food versus Pelosi doing this. I mean, you know, it's just that. Why don't you people get it? Move or listen to the science is a fool's errand. But
this has been the bane of like I spent my entire adult life working on climate change, and the climate movement's commitment to leaning on science as its primary legitimizer and motivating factor has been the biggest challenge that we've had. And we should do an episode on that sometime.
I would love to.
It's so frustrating. And the last thing that you made me think of when like responding to the woman with, whatever, screaming at the person with the mask, whatever. What's important to think about with that is like the media is cherry picking the most egregious stuff on their side too, which is like when we organize campaigns, we train people to say like, we need to have message discipline because the media is going to come to our stuff and pick the most like out of their mind stoned hippie who's going to say the dumbest stuff ever. And that's what's going to get on the news unless you have tremendous discipline of how you organize your folks and respond to the media. They're doing that to them too. And so when we respond to the most egregious stuff that gets caught on camera, and then we do get triggered by it, and if it triggers us into then deriding them, that's how the cycle keeps going. and it's just,
It's not good.
yeah.
Let's do, guys, first of all, do we have any other Discord questions to get to real quick? And then we'll do 2 sounds and Rebel music history. Where did you guys go? You guys dropped out. You guys are going to an open backup protest?
Can I say one last thing? Sorry,
we can't podcast the way we want to podcast. Fuck.
One last thing about it, and I know this might not make it onto whatever gets clipped, but just it feels coming up for me, is that there are real concerns about individual liberties that we are going to have to talk about and deal with on the left. And if we cede all that, and the right is the only ones talking about it, other than like, I know Glenn Greenwald has like a show where he's been talking about it with Edward Snowden. Other than that, I haven't seen anyone on the left talk about that. And if we don't, we need to actually start to deal with the reality of that at some point soon. And the right is obsessed with it, and they're turning people into the wrong direction with those concerns.
I could not agree more. I mean, I covered on this show, and I guess, and to Ari Melber's credit, he did a segment on, what Bill Barr was trying to do in terms of pretrial detention. But I think both as policy from the government, policy from private sector surveillance, and also, again, even just social attitudes. Like, I think, even all these like really, really toxic social habits that have formed around, various subcultures and all of this type of stuff reflects macro changes and a complete elimination of privacy and process. And that's a huge problem. So let's build something around that next week, because I think it really requires like an actual conversation. Because of course, and then yes, obviously, sure, great, cede it to Alex Jones, and we can sit around and talk about the science. I want to actually just add something. I said this the other day, just 2 seconds. This guy Parag Khan, I was watching an interview with him. He's this policy guy, and pretty different politics in some ways, but in a lot of ways. But he had this great point, which I appreciated the confidence of it, because somebody asked him about, he was primarily talking about Asian responses, and he's based in Singapore. But they were talking about Europe, and he was like, yeah, like, yes, Orban has made this power grab and it's horrible and whatever. And he's like, but Orban has actually not been very effective at dealing with Corona. And if you go back to Asia, the highest performers are South Korea, Taiwan, and then in Europe, like Germany, done pretty well. And he's like, so what? He's like, this isn't as like melodramatic as talking about authoritarians or whatever, but basically like high functioning democracies with national health care are doing best. And it's not like, it isn't like these doom stories or all this other stuff. Like, it's super conventional. It's super boring. It's what you'd expect. And it's what's happening. Mm-hmm. And I actually thought that was a very we should actually remember that. And again, not to valorize those governments, but it's like, no, it is cool that South Korea is crushing Hungary in response to this, relative to like just what kind of governance it's incentivizing. And it is cool, in fact, that actually the governing party just won a massive by-election in South Korea. They're getting rewarded for, increasing the minimum wage, trying to have peace on the peninsula, and handling Corona well. Like, that's cool. That's a good signal. Also, and the president's a big animal rights guy who's adopted a bunch of dogs. So I like that too.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.